Good morning and welcome back to Storytime Classics Live, produced by Southwest Shakespeare Company. I am your host, Bo Heckman, and today we are continuing in the spooky psychological thriller Rebecca. And with us is our guest reader, Amy Bjorklund. How are you? Welcome.
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I am well. So, what is happening in the world of Rebecca?
Well, we finally got to Manderley. Yay! They got married, they had a fast honeymoon, and we are now in the house, and we've met the dogs, we've met the groundskeeper, we've met the butler, we've met the house manager, the housekeeper, Miss not Van Deers. Yes, Mrs. Van Deers. Miss Danvers, my apologies, Miss Danvers. And so now we're going to dig into life in the house, that's where everything happens. So finally got there.
We have a couple of comments here from Stanley. We have a good morning, Amy. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you.
Is starting to get interesting now, Stanley says.
Mm-hmm.
We also have one from Catherine saying, hello, Bo and Amy. Hello, Catherine. How are you this morning?
Good morning.
Good and end. All right. Well, I don't wish to hold back the story, so I turn things over to you and take us into the world of Rebecca. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Bo. All right. We are reading this version, and we are on chapter 8. There it is. Chapter 8. So let us head back to Manderley, which is in bloom and gorgeous, and all of the flowers are making everything smell beautiful. And off we go. I had never realized, of course, that life at Manderley would be so orderly and planned. I remember now, looking back, how on the first morning Maxim was up and dressed and writing letters even before breakfast. And when I got downstairs, rather after 9 o'clock, a little flurried by the booming summons of the gong, I found he had nearly finished. He was already peeling his fruit. He looked up at me and smiled. "You mustn't mind," he said. "This is something you will have to get used to. I have no time to hang about at this hour of the day. Running a place like Manderley, you know, is a full-time job. The coffee and the hot dishes on the sideboard. We always help ourselves at breakfast." I said something about my clock being slow, about having too long in the bath, but he did not listen. He was looking down at the letter, frowning at something. How impressed I was, I remember well, impressed and a little overawed by the magnificence of the breakfast offered to us. There was tea in a great silver urn, and coffee too, and on the heater, piping hot, dishes of scrambled eggs, of bacon, and another fish. There was a little clutch of boiled eggs as well on their own special heater, and a porridge in a silver porringer. On another sideboard was a ham and great piece of cold bacon. There were scones, too, on the table, and toast, and various pots of jam, marmalade, and honey, while dessert dishes piled high with fruit stood at either end. It seemed strange to me that Maxim, who in Italy and France had eaten a croissant with fruit only and drank a cup of coffee, should sit down to this breakfast at home, enough for a dozen people, day after day probably, year after year, seeing nothing ridiculous about it, nothing wasteful. I noticed he had eaten a small piece of fish. I took a boiled egg, and I wondered what happened to the rest. All those scrambled eggs, that crisp bacon, the porridge, the remains of the fish. Were there menials, I wondered, whom I should never know, never see, waiting around kitchen doors for the gift of our breakfast? Or was it all thrown away, shoveled into dustpans? I would never know, of course. I would never dare to ask. "Thank the Lord I haven't a great crowd of relations to inflict upon you," said Maxim. "A sister I rarely see, and a grandmother who is nearly blind. Beatrice, by the way, asks herself over to lunch. I half expected she would. I suppose she wants to have a look at you." "Today?" I said, my spirits sinking to zero. "Yes, according to the letter I got this morning. She won't stay long. You'll like her, I think. She's very direct, believes in speaking her mind. No humbug at all. If she doesn't like you, she'll tell you so, to your face." I found this hardly comforting and wondered if there was not some virtue in the quality of insincerity. Maxim got up from his chair and lit a cigarette. "I've a mass of things to see to this morning. Do you think you can amuse yourself?" he said. "I'd like to have taken you around the garden, but I must see Crawley, my agent. I've been away from things too long. He'll be in touch too, by the way. You don't mind, do you? You'll be all right?" "Of course," I said. I shall be quite happy." Then he picked up his letters and went out of the room, and I remember thinking this was not how I imagined my first morning. I had seen us walking together, arms linked to the sea, coming back rather late and tired and happy to a cold lunch alone, and sitting afterwards under the chestnut tree where I could see the library window. I lingered long over my first breakfast, spinning out the time, and it was not until I saw Frith come in and look at me from behind the service screen that I realized it was after 10 o'clock. I sprang to my feet at once, feeling guilty, and apologized for sitting there so late, and he bowed, saying nothing, very polite, very correct, but I caught a flicker of surprise in his eyes. I wonder if I had said the wrong thing. Perhaps it did not do to apologize. Perhaps it lowered me in his estimation. I wish I knew what to do, what to say. I wondered if he suspected, as Miss Danvers had done, that poise and grace and assurance were not inbred in me, but were things to be acquired, painfully, perhaps, and slowly, costing me many bitter moments. As it was, leaving the room, I stumbled, not looking where I was going, catching my foot on the step by the door, and Frith came forward to help me, picking up my handkerchief, while Robert, the young footman, who was standing behind the screen, turned away to hide his smile. I heard the murmur of their voices as I crossed the hall, and one of them laughed. Robert, I supposed. Perhaps they were laughing about me. I went upstairs again to the privacy of my bedroom, but when I opened the door, I found the housemaids were in there doing the room, one sweeping the floor, the other dusting the dressing table. They looked at me in surprise. I quickly went out again. It could not be right, then, for me to go to my room at this hour in the morning. It's not expected of me. Broke the household routine. I crept downstairs once more, silently, thankful of my slippers that made no sound on the stone flags, and so into the library, which was chilly, the windows flung wide open, the fire laid but not lit. I shut the windows and looked round for a box of matches. I could not find one. I wondered what I should do. I did not like to ring, but the library, so snug and warm last night with the burning logs, was like an ice house now in the early morning. There were matches upstairs in the bedroom, but I did not like to go for them because it would mean disturbing the housemaids at their work. I could not bear the moon faces staring at me again. I decided that when Frith and Robert had left the dining room, I would fetch the matches from the sideboard. I tiptoed out into the hall and listened. They were still clearing. I could hear the sound of voices and the movement of trays. Presently, all was silent. They must have gone through the service doors into the kitchen quarters, so I went across the hall and into the dining room once more. Yes, there was a box of matches on the sideboard, as I expected. I crossed the room quickly and picked them up, and as I did so, Frith came back into the room. I tried to cram the box furtively into my pocket, but I saw him glance at my hand in surprise. "Did you require anything, madam?" he said. "Oh, Frith," I said awkwardly, "I could not find any matches." He at once proffered me another box, handing me the cigarettes too at the same time. This was another embarrassment, for I did not smoke. "No, the fact is," I said, "I felt rather cool in the library. I suppose the weather seems chilly to me after being abroad, and I thought perhaps I would just put a match to the fire." "The fire in the library is not usually lit until the afternoon, madam," he said. "Mrs. De Winter always used the morning room. There is a good fire in there. Of course, if you should wish to have the fire in the library as well, I will give orders for it to be lit." "Oh, no," I said. "I would not dream of it. I will go into the morning room. Thank you, Frith." "You will find writing paper and pens and ink in there, madam," he said. Mrs. De Winter always did her correspondence and telephoning in the morning room after breakfast. The house telephone is also there, should you wish to speak to Mrs. Danvers." "Thank you, Frith," I said. I turned away into the hall again, humming a little tune to give me an air of confidence. I could not tell him that I had never seen the morning room, that Maxim had not shown it to me the night before. I knew he was standing in the entrance to the dining room, watching me as I went across the hall, and that I must make some show of knowing my way. There was a door to the left of the great staircase, and I went recklessly toward it, praying in my heart that it would take me to my goal. But when I came to it and opened it, I saw that it was a garden room, a place for odds and ends. There was a table where flowers were done, there were basket chairs stacked against the wall, and a couple of macintoshes, too, hanging on a peg. I came out, a little defiantly, glancing across the hall, and saw Frith still standing there. I had not deceived him though, not for a moment. "You go through the drawing room to the morning room, madam, through the doors there, on your right, this side of the staircase. You go straight through the double drawing room and turn to your left." "Thank you, Frith," I said humbly, pretending no longer. I went through the long drawing room as he had directed. A lovely room this, beautifully proportioned, looking out upon the lawns down to the sea. The public would see this room, I suppose, and Frith, if he showed them around, would know the history of the pictures on the wall and the period of the furniture. It was beautiful, of course. I knew that. And those chairs and tables probably without price, but for all that I had no wish to linger there. I could not see myself sitting ever in those chairs, standing before that carved mantelpiece, throwing books down to the tables. It had all the formality of a room in a museum, where alcoves were roped off and a guardian in a cloak and hat like the guides in the French chateau sat in a chair behind the door. I went through then and turned to the left, and so on to the little morning room I had not seen before. I was glad to see the dogs there, sitting before the fire, and Jasper, the younger, came over to me at once, his tail waggling, and thrust his nose into my hand. The old one lifted her muzzle at my approach and gazed in my direction with her blind eyes. But when she had sniffed the air a moment and found I was not the one she sought, she turned her head away with a grunt and looked steadily into the fire again. Then Jasper left me too, and settled himself by the side of his companion, licking his side. This was their routine. They knew, even as Frith had known, that the library fire was not lit until the afternoon. They came to the morning room from long custom. Somehow I guessed, before going to the window, that the room looked out upon the rhododendrons. Yes, there they were, blood-red and luscious, as I had seen them the evening before. Great bushes of them, massed beneath the open window, encroaching on the sweep of the drive itself. There was a little clearing, too, between the bushes, like a miniature lawn, the grass of a smooth carpet of moss, and in the center of this, the tiny statue of a naked faun, his pipes to his lips. The crimson rhododendrons made his background, and the clearing itself was like a little stage where he would dance and play his part. There was no musty smell about this room as there had been in the library. There were no old, well-worn chairs, no tables littered with magazines and papers, seldom if ever read, but left there from a long custom because Maxim's father, or even his grandfather perhaps, had wished it so. This was a woman's room, graceful, fragile, the room of someone who had chosen every particle of furniture with great care, so that each chair, each vase, each small infinitesimal thing should be in harmony with one another and with her own personality. It was as though she who had arranged this room had said, "This I will have, and this, taking piece by piece from the treasures in Manderley's each object that placed her best, ignoring the second-rate, the mediocre, laying her hand with sure and certain instinct only upon the best." Yes, Catherine, totally. At this point, we're probably glad that dogs don't speak, right? We're glad that they just silently guided her, like, we'll wait for you. There was no intermingling of style, no confusing of period, and the result was perfection in a strange and startling way, not coldly formal like the drawing room shown to the public, but vividly alive, having something of the same glow and brilliance that the rhododendrons had, massed there beneath the window. And I noticed then that the rhododendrons, not content with forming their theater on the little lawn outside the window, had been permitted into the room itself. Their great warm faces looked down upon me from the mantelpiece. They floated in a bowl upon the table by the sofa. They stood, lean and graceful, on the writing desk beside the golden candlesticks. The room was filled with them. Even the walls took color from them, becoming rich and glowing in the morning sun. They were the only flowers in the room. And I wondered if there was some purpose in it, whether the room had been arranged originally with this one end in view, for nowhere else in the house did the rhododendrons obtrude. There were flowers in the dining room, flowers in the library, but orderly and trim, rather in the background, not like this, not in profusion. I went and sat down at the writing desk, and I thought how strange it was that this room, so lovely and so rich in color, should be at the same time so businesslike and purposeful. Somehow I should have expected that a room furnished as this was in such exquisite taste, for all the exaggeration of the flowers, should be a place of decoration only, luxurious and intimate. But this writing table, beautiful as it was no pretty toy where a woman would scribble little notes, nibbling at the end of a pen, leaving it day after day in carelessness, the blotter a little askew. The pigeonholes were docketed letters unanswered, letters to keep, household, estate, menus, miscellaneous, addresses. each ticket written in that same scrawly, pointed hand that I knew already. And it shocked me, even startled me, to recognize it again, for I had not seen it since I had destroyed the page from the book of poems, and I had not thought to see it again. I opened a drawer at hazard, and there was the writing once more, this time in an open leather book whose heading, Guests at Manderley, showed at once, divided into weeks and months, what visitors had come and gone, the rooms they had used, and food they had eaten. I turned over the pages and saw the book was a complete record of a year, so that the hostess, glancing back, would be able to know to the day, almost to the hour, what guest had passed what night under her roof, and where he had slept, and what she had given them to eat. There was notepaper also in the drawer, thick white sheets for rough writing, and the notepaper of the house with the crest and the address, and visiting cards, ivory white in little boxes. I took one out and looked at it, under this thin tissue of paper. Mrs. M. De Winter, it said, and in the corner, Manderley. I put it back in the box again and shut the drawer, feeling guilty suddenly and deceitful, as though I were staying in someone else's house and my hostess had said to me, "Yes, of course, write letters at my desk." And I had unforgivably, in a stealthy manner, peeped at her correspondence. At any moment, she might come back into the room and she would see me there, sitting there at her open drawer, which I had no right to touch. And when the telephone rang, suddenly, alarmingly, on the desk in front of me, my heart leapt and I started up in terror, thinking I had been discovered. I took the receiver off the trembling hands and, "Who is it? What do you want?" There was a strange buzzing at the end of the line, and then a voice came, low and rather harsh. Whether that of a woman or a man I could not tell, and, "Mrs. De Winter?" it said. "Mrs. De Winter?" "I'm afraid you have made a mistake," I said. "Mrs. De Winter has been dead for over a year." I sat there, waiting, staring stupidly into the mouthpiece, and it was not until the name was repeated again, the voice incredulous, slightly raised, that I became aware with a rush of color to my face that I had blundered irretrievably and could not take back my words. "It's Mrs. Danvers, madam," said the phone. "I'm speaking to you on the house telephone." My faux pas was so palpably obvious, so idiotic and unpardonable that to ignore it would show me to be an even greater fool, if possible, than I already was. I'm sorry, Mrs. Danvers," I said, stammering, my words tumbling over one another. "The telephone startled me. I didn't know what I was saying. I didn't realize the call was for me, and I never noticed I was speaking on the house phone." "I'm sorry to have disturbed you, madam," she said. And she knows, I thought, she guesses I have been looking through the desk. "I only wondered whether you wished to see me and whether you approved of the menus for today." "Oh," I said. "Oh, I'm sure I do. That is, I'm sure I approve of the menus. Just order what you like, Mrs. Danvers. You needn't bother to ask me." "It would be better, I think, if you read the list," continued the voice. "You'll find the menu of the day on the blotter beside you." I searched feverishly around me on the desk and found at last a sheet of paper I had not noticed before. I glanced hurriedly through it: curried prawns, roast veal asparagus, cold chocolate mousse. It was the lunch or dinner I could not see. Lunch, I supposed. "Yes, Mrs. Danvers," I said. "Very suitable. Very nice indeed." "If you wish to have anything changed, please say so," she answered, "and I will give orders at once. You will notice I have left a blank space beside the sauce for you to mark your preference. I was not sure what sauce you are used to having served with the roast veal. Mrs. De Winter was very particular about her sauces, and I always had to refer to her." "Oh," I said. "Oh, well, let me see, Mrs. Danvers. I hardly know. I think we had better have what you usually have. Whatever you think Mrs. De Winter would have ordered." "You have no preference, madam?" "No," I said. "Not really, Mrs. Danvers." "I rather think Mrs. De Winter would have ordered a white sauce, madam." "We will have the same sauce, then, of course," I said. "I'm very sorry I disturbed you while you were writing, madam." "You didn't disturb me at all," I said. "Please don't apologize." "The post leaves at midday, and Robert will come for your letters and stamp them himself," she said. "All you have to do is ring through to him on the telephone if you have anything urgent to be sent, and he will give orders for them to be taken to the post office immediately." "Thank you, Mrs. Danvers," I said. I listened for a moment, but she said no more, and then I heard a little click at the end of the telephone, which meant she had replaced the receiver. I did the same. Then I looked down again at the desk and the notepaper, ready for use, upon the blotter. In front of me stared the ticketed pigeonholes and the words upon them: letters unanswered, estate, miscellaneous. They were like a reproach to me in my idleness. She who sat here before me had not wasted her time, as I was doing. She had reached out for the house telephone and had given her orders of the day, swiftly, efficiently, and rung her pencil, perhaps, through an item on the menu that had not pleased her. She had not said, "Yes, Mrs. Danvers," and "Of course, Mrs. Danvers," as I had done. And then, when she had finished, she began her letters. 5, 6, 7, perhaps, to be answered, all written in that same curious, slanting hand I knew so well. She would tear off sheet after sheet of that smooth white paper, using it extravagantly, because the long strokes she made when she wrote, and at the end of each of her personal letters she put her signature, Rebecca, that tall, sloping R dwarfing its fellows. I drummed my fingers on the desk. The pigeonholes were empty now. There were no letters unanswered, waiting to be dealt with, no bills to pay that I knew anything about. If I had anything urgent, Mrs. Danvers said, I must telephone through to Robert, and he would give orders for it to be taken to the post. I wondered how many urgent letters Rebecca used to write, and who they were written to. Dressmakers, perhaps. I must have the white satin on Tuesday, without fail, or to hairdresser. I shall be coming up next Friday and want an appointment at 3 o'clock with Monsieur d'Antoine himself. Shampoo, massage, set, and manicure. No letters of that type would be a waste of time. She would have a call put through to London. Frith would do it. Frith would say, "I'm speaking for Mrs. De Winter." Went on drumming with my fingers on the desk. I could think of nobody to write to. Only Mrs. Van Hopper. There was something foolish, rather ironical, in the realization that here I was, sitting at my own desk in my own home, with nothing better to do than to write a letter to Mrs. Van Hopper, a woman I disliked, whom I should never see again. Pulled a sheet of notepaper out towards me. I look up at the narrow, slender pen with a bright, pointed nib. "Dear Mrs. Van Hopper," I began. And as I wrote, in halting, labored fashion, saying I hoped the voyage had been good, that she had found her daughter better, that the weather in New York was fine and warm, I noticed for the first time how cramped and unformed was my own handwriting, without individuality, without style, uneducated even, the writing of an indifferent pupil taught in a second-rate school. Chapter 9. When I heard the sound of the car in the drive, I got up in a sudden panic, glancing at the clock, for I knew that it meant Beatrice and her husband had arrived. It was only just gone 12. They were much earlier than I expected. And Maxim was not yet back. I wonder if it would be possible to hide, to get out of the window into the garden so that Frith, bringing them into the morning room, would say, "Madam must have just gone out." And it would seem quite natural. They would just take it as a matter of course. The dogs looked up inquiringly as I ran to the window, and Jasper followed me, wagging his tail. The window opened out onto the terrace and the little grass clearing beyond. But as I was prepared to brush past the rhododendrons, the sound of voices came close, and I backed again into the room. They were coming to the house by way of the garden, Frith having told them, doubtless, that I was in the morning room. I went quickly into the big drawing room and made for a door near me on the left. It led to a long stone passage, and I ran along it, fully aware of my stupidity, despising myself for this sudden attack of nerves. But I knew I could not face these people, not for a moment anyway. The passage seemed to be taking me to the back regions, and as I turned a corner, coming upon another staircase, I met a servant I had not met before, a scullery maid, perhaps. She carried a mop and a pail in her hands. She stared at me in wonder as though I were a vision, unexpected in this part of the house, and "Good morning," I said, in great confusion, making for the stairway, and "Good morning, madam," she returned, her mouth open, her round eyes inquisitive as I climbed the stairs. They would lead me, I supposed, to the bedrooms, and I could find my suite on the east wing and sit up there a while until I judged it nearly time for lunch, when good manners would compel me to come down again. But I must have lost my bearings, for passing through a door at the head of the stairs, I came to a long corridor that I had not seen before, similar in some ways to the one on the east wing, but broader and dark owing to the paneling of the walls. I hesitated, then turned left, coming upon a broad landing and another staircase. It was very quiet and dark. No one was about. If there had been any housemaids here during the morning, they had finished their work by now and gone downstairs. There was no trace of their presence, no lingering dust smell of carpets lately swept, and I thought, as I stood there, wondering which way to turn, that the silence was unusual, holding something of the same oppression as an empty house does when the owners have gone away. I opened a door at hazard and found a room in total darkness, no chink of light coming through the closed shutters, while I could see dimly in the center of the room the outline of furniture swathed in white dust sheets. The room smelt close and stale, the smell of a room seldom, if ever, used, whose ornaments are herded together in the center of a bed and left there, covered with a sheet. It might be, too, that the curtains had not been drawn from the window since some preceding summer, and if one crossed there now and pulled them aside, opening the creaking shutters, a dead moth who had been imprisoned behind them for many months would fall to the carpet and lie there, beside a forgotten pin and a dried leaf blown there before the windows were closed last summer. I shut the door softly and went uncertainly along the corridor, flanked on either side by doors, all of them closed, till I came to a little alcove set in an outside wall where a broad window gave me a light at last. I looked out and saw below me in the smooth grass lawn stretched to the sea, and the sea itself, bright green, with white-topped crests whipped by a westerly wind and scudded from the shore. It was closer than I had thought, much closer. It ran, surely, beneath those little knot of trees below the lawns, barely 5 minutes away, and if I listened now, my ear to the window, I could hear the surf breaking on the shores of some little bay I could not see. I knew then I had made the circuit of the house and was standing in the corridor of the west wing. Yes, Mrs. Danvers was right. You could hear the sea from here. You might imagine in the winter would creep up on those green lawns and threaten the house itself, for even now, because of the high wind, there was a mist upon the window glass, as though someone had breathed upon it. A mist salt-laden, borne upwards from the sea. A hurrying cloud hid the sun for a moment as I watched, and the sea changed colors instantly, becoming black, and the white crests with them very pitiless suddenly, and cruel, not the gay, sparkling sea I had looked on first. Somehow I was glad my rooms were on the east wing. I preferred the rose garden, after all, to the sound of the sea. I went back to the landing then, at the top of the stairs, and as I prepared to go down, one hand upon the banister, I heard the door behind me open, and it was Mrs. Danvers. We stared at one another for a moment without speaking, and I could not be certain whether it was anger I read in her eyes or curiosity, for her face became a mask directly she saw me. Although she said nothing, I felt guilty and ashamed, as though I had been caught trespassing, and I felt the telltale color come into my face. I lost my way, I said. I was trying to find my room. You have come to the opposite side of the house, she said. This is the west wing. Yes, I know. Did you go into any of the rooms? She asked me. No, I just opened a door. Did not go in. Everything was dark, covered up in dust sheets. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb anything. I expect you like to keep things all shut up. If you wish to open up the rooms, I will have it done, she said. You only have to tell me. The rooms are all furnished and can be used. Oh, no, I did not mean you to think that. Perhaps you would like me to show you all over the west wing? I shook my head. No, rather not. No, I must go downstairs. I began to walk down the stairs, and she came with me, by my side, as though she were a warden and I in custody. Any time when you have nothing to do, you have only to ask me, and I will show the rooms on the west wing, she persisted, making me vaguely uncomfortable. I knew not why. Her insistence struck a chord in my memory, reminding me of a visit to a friend's house as a child when the daughter of the house, older than I am, took my hand and whispered in my ear, I know where there's a book locked in a cupboard in my mother's bedroom. Shall we go and look at it? I remembered her white, excited face and her small, beady eyes and the way she kept pinching at my arms. I will have the dust sheets removed, and then you can see the rooms as they have looked when they were used, said Mrs. Danvers. I would have shown you this morning, but I believed you to be writing letters in the morning room. You have only to telephone me through to my room, you know, when you want me. It would only take a short while to have the rooms in readiness. We had come down the short flight of stairs, and she opened another door, standing aside for me to pass through, her dark eyes questing my face. It's very kind of you, Mrs. Danvers, I said. I will let you know sometime. We passed out together onto the landing beyond, and I saw we were at the head of the main staircase now, behind the minstrel's gallery. I wonder how you came to miss your way, she said. The door through the west wing is very different to this. I did not come this way, I said. Then you must have come up the back way from the stone passage. Yes, I said, not meeting her eyes. Yes, I came through the stone passage. She went on looking at me as though she expected me to tell her why I left the morning room in such panic, going through the back regions, and I felt suddenly that she knew, that she must have watched me, that she had seen me wandering perhaps in the west wing from the first, her eye a crack in the door. Mrs. Lacey and Major Lacey have been here some time, she said. I heard their car drive up shortly after 12. Oh, I said, I had not realized that. Frith will have taken them to the morning room. It must be getting on for 12:30. You know your way now, don't you? Yes, Mrs. Danvers, I said, and I went down the big stairway into the hall, knowing she was standing there above me, her eyes watching me. I knew I must go back now to the morning room and meet Maxim's sister and her husband. I could not hide in my bedroom now. As I went into the drawing room, I glanced back over my shoulder and saw Mrs. Danvers still standing there ahead of the stairs like a black sentinel. I stood for a moment outside the morning room with my hand on the door, listening to the hum of voices. Maxim had returned then, while I had been upstairs, bringing his agent with him, I supposed, for it sounded to me as if the room was full of people. I was aware of the same feeling of sick uncertainty I had experienced so often as a kid when summoned to shake hands with visitors, and turning the handle to the door, I blundered in, to be met at once, it seemed, with a sea of faces and general silence. Here she is at last, said Maxim. Where have you been hiding? We were thinking of sending out a search party. Here is Beatrice, and this is Giles, and this is Frank Crawley. Look out, you nearly trod the dog. Beatrice was tall, broad-shouldered, very handsome, very much like Maxim about the eyes and jaw, but not as smart as I had expected, much tweedier. The sort of person who would nurse dogs through distemper, know about horses, shoot well. She did not kiss me. She took hands very firmly, looking me straight in the eye, and then she turned to Maxim. Quite different from what I expected. Doesn't answer to your description at all. Everyone laughed, and I joined in, not quite certain if the laugh was against me or not, wondering secretly what it was she had expected and what had been Maxim's description. And this is Giles, said Maxim, prodding my arm, and Giles stretched out an enormous paw and wrung my hand, squeezing the fingers limp, genial eyes smiling from behind horn-rimmed glasses. Frank Crawley, said Maxim, and I turned to the agent, a colorless, rather thin man with a prominent Adam's apple, in whose eyes I read relief as he looked upon me. I wondered why, but I had no time to think of that, because Frith had come in and was offering me sherry, and Beatrice was talking to me again. Maxim tells me you only got back last night. I had not realized that, or of course we would have never thrust ourselves upon you so soon. Well, what do you think of Manderley? I've scarcely seen anything of it yet, I answered. It's beautiful, of course. She was looking me up and down, as I had expected, but in a direct, straightforward fashion, not maliciously like Mrs. Danvers, not with unfriendliness. She had a right to judge me. She was Maxim's sister, and Maxim himself came to my side now, putting his arm through mine, giving me confidence. You're looking better, old man, she said to him, her head on one side, considering him. You've lost that fine, drawn look, thank goodness. I suppose we've got you to thank for that, nodding at me. I'm always very fit, said Maxim shortly. Never had anything wrong with me in my life. You imagine everyone ill who doesn't look as fat as Giles. Bosh, said Beatrice. You know perfectly well you were a perfect wreck 6 months ago. Gave me the fright of my life when I came and saw you. I thought you were in for a breakdown. Giles, bear me out. Didn't Maxim look perfectly ghastly last time we came over here? And didn't I say he was headed for a breakdown? Well, I must say, old chap, you're looking like a different person, said Giles. Very good thing you went away. Doesn't he look well, Crawley? I could tell by the tightening of Maxim's muscles under my arm that he was trying to keep his temper. For some reason, this talk about his health was not welcome to him, angered him evenly, and I thought it tactless of Beatrice to harp upon it on this way, making so big a point of it. Maxim's very sunburnt, I said shyly. It hides a multitude of sins. You should have seen him in Venice, having breakfast on the balcony, trying to get brown on purpose. He thinks it makes him better looking. Everyone laughed, and Mr. Crawley said, Must have been wonderful in Venice, Mrs. De Winters, this time of year. And yes, I said, we had really wonderful weather. Only one bad day, wasn't it, Maxim? The conversation drawing away happily from his health, and so to Italy, safest of subjects, and the blessed topic of fine weather. Conversation was easy now, no longer an effort. Maxim and Giles and Beatrice were discussing the running of Maxim's car, and Mr. Crawley was asking if it was true there were no more gondolas in the canals now, only motorboats. I didn't think he would have cared at all had there been steamers at anchor in the Grand Canal. He was saying this to help me. It was his contribution to the little effort of steering the talk away from Maxim's health, and I was grateful to him, feeling an ally for all his dull appearance. "Jasper wants exercise," said Beatrice, stirring the dog with her foot. "He's getting much too fat, and he's barely 2 years old. What do you feed him on, Maxim?" "My dear Beatrice, he has exactly the same routine as your dogs," said Maxim. "Don't show off and make out you know more about animals than I do." "Dear old boy, how can you pretend to know what Jasper's been fed on when you've been away for a couple of months? Don't tell me Frith walks on the lodge's gates with him twice a day. This dog hasn't had a run for weeks. I can tell by the condition of his coat." "I'd rather he looked colossal than half-starved like that half-wit dog of yours," said Maxim. "Not a very intelligent remark when Lion won first to Fritz last February," said Beatrice. The atmosphere was becoming rather strained again. I could tell by the narrow line of Maxim's mouth, and I wondered if brothers and sisters always sparred like this, making it uncomfortable for those who listened. I wished that Frith would come in and announce lunch, or would be summoned by a booming gong. I did not know what happened at Manderley. "How far away from us are you?" I asked, sitting down by Beatrice. "Did you have to make a very early start?" "We're 50 miles away, my dear, in the next county, the other side of Trowster. The hunting is so much better with us. You must come over and stay when Maxim can spare you. Giles will mount you." "I'm afraid I don't hunt," I confessed. "I learned to ride as a child, but very feebly. I don't remember much about it." "You must take it up again," she said. "You can't possibly live in the country and not ride. You wouldn't know what to do with yourself. Maxim says you paint? That's very nice, of course, but there's no exercise in it, is there? All very well on a wet day when there's nothing better to do." "My dear Beatrice, we are not all such fresh air fiends as you," said Maxim. "I wasn't talking to you, old boy. We all know you are perfectly happy slopping about the Manderley Gardens and never breaking out of a slow walk." "I'm very fond of walking too," I said swiftly. "I'm sure I shall never get tired of rambling about Manderley, and I can bathe too when it's warmer." "My dear, you are an optimist," said Beatrice. "I can hardly ever remember bathing here. The water is far too cold, and the beach is shingle." "I don't mind that," I said. "I love bathing. As long as the currents aren't too strong. Is the bathing safe at the bay?" Nobody answered, and I realized suddenly what I had said. My heart thumped, and I felt my cheeks go flaming red. I bent down to stroke Jasper's ear in analogy of confusion. "Jasper could do with a swim and get some of that fat off," said Beatrice, breaking the pause. "But he'd find it a bit too much for him in the bay, wouldn't you, Jasper? Good old Jasper. Nice old man." We petted the dog together, not looking at one another. "I say, I am getting infernally hungry. What on earth is happening to lunch?" said Maxim. "Oh, it's only just 1 now," said Mr. Crawley, "according to the clock on the mantelpiece." "That clock was always fast," said Beatrice. "It's kept perfect time now for months," said Maxim. At that moment, the door opened and Frith announced that luncheon was served. "I say, I must have a wash," said Giles, looking at his hands. We all got up and wandered through the drawing room to the hall in great relief, Beatrice and I a little ahead of the men, she taking my arm. "Dear old Frith," she said. "He always looks exactly the same and makes me feel like a girl again. You know, don't mind me saying, though, you are even younger than I expected. Maxim told me your age, but you are an absolute child. Tell me, are you very much in love with him?" I was not prepared for this question, and she must have seen the surprise on my face, for she laughed lightly and squeezed my arm. "Don't answer," she said. "I can see what you feel. I'm an inferring bore, aren't I? You mustn't mind me. I am devoted to Maxim, you know, though we always bicker like cat and dog when we meet. I congratulate you again on his looks. We were all very worried about him this time last year, but of course you know the whole story." We'd come to the dining room by now, and she said no more, for the servants were there and the others had joined us. But as I sat down and unfolded my napkin, I wonder what Beatrice would say when she realized that I knew nothing of the preceding year. No details of the tragedy that had happened down there in the bay, that Maxim kept those things to himself, that I questioned him never. Lunch passed off better than I had dared to hope. There were few arguments, of course, perhaps Beatrice was exercising tact at last. At any rate, she and Maxim chatted about matters concerning Manderley, her horses, the garden, mutual friends, and Frank Crawley, on my left, kept up an easy patter with me, for which I was grateful, as it required no effort. Giles was more concerned with food than with conversation, though now and again he remembered my existence and flung me a remark at hazard. "Same cook, I suppose, Maxim?" he said, when Robert had offered him the cold souffle for the second time. "I always tell B, Manderley's the only place left in England where one can get decent cooking. I remember this souffle of old." "I think we change cooks periodically," said Maxim, "but the standard of cooking remains the same. Mrs. Danvers has all the recipes. She tells them what to do." "Amazing woman, that Mrs. Danvers," said Giles, turning to me. "Don't you think so?" "Oh, yes," I said. "Mrs. Danvers seemed to be a wonderful person." "She's no oil painting, though, is she?" said Giles, and he roared with laughter. Frank Crawley said nothing, and looking up, I saw Beatrice was watching me. She turned away then and began talking to Maxim. "Do you play golf at all, Mrs. De Winter?" said Mr. Crawley. "No, I'm afraid I don't," I answered, glad that the subject had been changed again, and that Mrs. Danvers was forgotten. And even though I was no player, knew nothing of the game, I was prepared to listen to him for as long as he pleased. There was something solid and safe and dull about golf. It could not bring us to any difficulties. We had cheese and coffee, and I wondered whether I was supposed to make a move. I kept looking at Maxim, but he gave no sign. And then Giles embarked upon a story rather difficult to follow about digging a car out of a snowdrift. What had started the train of thought I could not tell. And I listened to him politely, nodding my head now and again, smiling, aware of Maxim becoming restive in his state at the end of the table. At last he paused, and I caught Maxim's eye. He frowned very slightly and jerked his head through the door. I got up at once, shaking the table clumsily as I moved my chair, upsetting Giles's glass of port. "Oh dear," I said, hovering, wondering what to do, reaching ineffectively for my napkin, but "All right, Frith will deal with it," said Maxim. "Don't add to the confusion. Beatrice, take her out to the garden. She's scarcely seen the place yet." He looked tired, rather jaded, and I began to wish none of them had come. They had spoiled our day anyway. It was too much of an effort, just as we had returned. I felt tired, too, tired and depressed. Maxim had seemed almost irritable when he suggested we should go to the garden. What a fool I had been, upsetting that glass of port. We went on to the terrace and walked down to the smooth green lawns. "I think it's a pity you came back to Manderley so soon," said Beatrice. "It would have been far better to potter about in Italy for 3 or 4 months, and then come back in the middle of the summer. Done Maxim a power of good, too, besides being easier from your point of view. I can't help feeling it's all going to be rather a strain here for you at first." "Oh, I don't think so," I said. "I know I shall come to love Manderley." She did not answer, and we strolled backwards and forwards on the lawn. "Tell me a bit about yourself," she said at last. "What was it you were doing in the south of France?" "Living with some appalling American woman," Maxim said. I explained about Mrs. Van Hopper and what had led to it, and she seemed sympathetic but a little vague, as though she was thinking of something else. "Yes," she said when I paused. "It all happened very suddenly, as you say. But of course we were all delighted, my dear, and I do hope you will be happy." "Thank you, Beatrice," I said. "Thank you very much." I wondered why she said she hoped we would be happy instead of saying she knew we would be so. She was kind. She was sincere. I liked her very much, but there was a tiny doubt in her voice that made me afraid. "When Maxim wrote and told me," she went on, taking my arm, "and said he had discovered you in the south of France, and you were very young, very pretty, I must admit it gave me a bit of a shock. Of course, we all expected a social butterfly, very modern and plastered with paint. The sort of girl you expect to meet in these sort of places. When you came into the morning room before lunch, you could have knocked me down with a feather." She laughed, and I laughed with her, but she did not say whether or not she was disappointed in my appearance or relieved. "Poor Maxim," she said. "He went through a ghastly time, and let's hope you have made him forget about it. Of course, he adores Manderley." Part of me wanted her to continue her train of thought, to tell me more of the past, naturally and easily like this. Something else, way in the back of my mind, did not want to know, did not want to hear. "We are not a bit alike, you know," she said. "Our characters are poles apart. I show everything in my face, whether I like people or not, whether I'm angry or pleased. There's no reserve about me." Maxim is entirely different. Very quiet, very reserved. You never know what's going on in that funny mind of his. I lose my temper on the slightest provocation, flare up, and then it's over. Maxim loses his temper once or twice a year, and when he does, my God, he does lose it. I don't suppose he ever will with you. I should think you are a placid little thing. Thank you. She smiled and pinched my arm, and I thought about being placid. How quiet and comfortable it sounded. Someone with knitting on her lap, with calm, unruffled brow. Someone who was never anxious, never tortured by doubt and indecision. Someone who never stood as I did, hopeful, eager, frightened, tearing at bitten nails, uncertain which way to go, which star to follow. You don't mind me saying so, will you? She went on, but I think you ought to do something with your hair. Why don't you have it waved? So very lanky, isn't it, like that? Must look awful under a hat. Why don't you sweep it back behind your ears? I did so, obediently, and waited for her approval. She looked at me critically, her head on one side. No, she said. No, I think that's worse. It's too severe. It doesn't suit you. No. All you need is a wave. Just pinch it up. I never have cared for that Joan of Arc business, or whatever they call it. What does Maxim say? Does he think it suits you? I don't know, I said. He's never mentioned it. Oh, well, perhaps he likes it. Don't go by me. Tell me, did you get any clothes in London or Paris? No, I said. We had no time. Maxim was anxious to get home, and I can always send for catalogs. I can tell by the way you dress that you don't care a hoot what you wear, she said. I glanced down at my flannel skirt apologetically. I do, I said. I'm very fond of nice things. Never had much money to spend on clothes up to now. I wonder Maxim did not stay a week or so in London and get you something decent to wear. I must say, I think it rather selfish of him. So unlike him, too. He's generally so particular. Is he? He said. He's never seemed particular to me. I don't think he notices what I wear at all, and I don't think he minds. Oh, she said. Well, he must have changed then. She looked away from me and whistled to Jasper, her hands on her pockets, and then stared up at the house above us. You're not using the west wing, then, she said. No, I said. No, we have the suite on the east wing. It's all been done up. Has it? She said. I don't know why. I wondered why. Oh, it was Maxim's idea, I said. He seems to prefer it. She said nothing. She went on looking at the windows and whistling. How do you get on with Mrs. Danvers? She said suddenly. I bent down and began patting Jasper's head and stroking his ears. I have not seen very much of her, I said. She scares me a little. I've never seen anyone quite like her before. I don't suppose you have, said Beatrice. Jasper looked up at me with great eyes, humble, rather self-conscious. I kissed the top of his silken head and put my hand over his black nose. There's no need to be frightened of her, said Beatrice, and don't let her see it, whatever you do. Of course, I've never had anything to do with her, and I don't think I ever want to either. However, she's always been very civil to me. I went on patting Jasper's head. Did she seem friendly? No, I said. No, not very. Beatrice began whistling again, and she rubbed Jasper's head with her foot. I shouldn't have more to do with her than you can help, she said. No, I said. She runs the house very efficiently. There's no need for me to interfere. Oh, I don't suppose she'd mind that, said Beatrice. That's what Maxim had said the night before, and I thought it odd that they should both have the same opinion. I should have imagined that interference was the one thing Mrs. Danvers did not want. I dare say she will get over it in time, said Beatrice, but it may make things rather unpleasant for you at first. Of course, she's insanely jealous. I was afraid she would be. Why? I said, looking up at her. Why would she be jealous? Maxim does not seem to be particularly fond of her. My child, it is not Maxim she's thinking of, said Beatrice. I think she respects him and all that, but nothing more very much. No, you see... She paused, frowning a little, looking at me uncertainly. She resents your being here at all. That's the trouble. Why? I said. Why should she resent me? I thought you knew, said Beatrice. I thought Maxim would have told you. She simply adored Rebecca. Oh, I said. Oh, I see. We both went on, patting and stroking Jasper, who, unaccustomed to so much attention, rolled over on his back in ecstasy. Here are the men, said Beatrice. Let's have some chairs out and sit under the chestnut. Oh, how fat Giles is getting. He looks quite repulsive beside Maxim. I suppose Frank will go back to the office. What a dull creature he is. Never has anything interesting to say. Well, what have you been discussing? Pulling the world to bits, I suppose? She laughed, and the others strolled toward us, and we all stood about. Giles threw a twig for Jasper to receive. We all looked at Jasper. Mr. Crawley looked at his watch. I must be off, he said. Thank you very much for lunch, Mrs. De Winter. You must come often, I said, shaking hands. I wondered if the others would go too. I was not sure whether they had come for lunch or to spend the day. I hoped they would go. I wanted to be alone with Maxim again, and that it would be like when we were in Italy. We all went and sat down under the chestnut tree. Robert brought out chairs and rugs. Giles lay down on his back and tipped his hat over his eyes. After a while, he began to snore, his mouth open. Shut up, Giles, said Beatrice. I am not asleep, he muttered, opening his eyes and shutting them again. I thought him unattractive. I wonder why Beatrice had married him. She could never have been in love with him. Perhaps that was what she was thinking about me. I caught her eye upon me now and again, puzzled, reflective, as though she was saying to herself, what on earth does Maxim see in her? But kind at the same time, not unfriendly. They were talking about their grandmother. We must go over and see the old lady, Maxim was saying, and she's getting gaga, said Beatrice. Drops food all down her chin, poor darling. I listened to them both, leaning against Maxim's arms, rubbing my chin on his sleeve. He stroked my hand absently, not thinking, talking to Beatrice. That's what I do to Jasper, I thought. I'm being like Jasper now, leaning against him. He pats me now and again when he remembers, and I'm pleased. I get closer to him for a moment. He likes me in the way I like Jasper. The wind had dropped. The afternoon was drowsy, peaceful. The grass had been new mown. It smelt sweet and rich like summer. A bee droned above Giles's head, and he flicked at it with his hat. Jasper sloped in to join us, too warm in the sun, his tongue lolling from his mouth. He flopped beside me and began licking his side, his large eyes apologetic. The sun shone on the mullioned windows of the house, and I could see the green lawns and the terrace reflect in them. Smoke curled thinly from one of the near chimneys, and I wondered if the library fire had been lit, according to routine. A thrush flew across the lawn to the magnolia tree outside the dining room window. I could smell the faint, soft magnolia scent as I sat there on the lawn. Everything was quiet and still. Very distant now came the washing of the sea and the bay below. The tide must have gone out. The bee droned over us again, pausing to taste the chestnut blossom above their heads. This is what I have always imagined, I thought. This is how I hoped it would be, living at Manderley. I wanted to go on sitting there, not talking, not listening to the others, keeping the moment precious for all time because we were peaceful, all of us. We were content and drowsy even as the bee who droned above our heads. In a little while it would be different. There would come tomorrow and the next day and another year, and we would be changed, perhaps, never sitting quite like this again. Some of us would go away, or suffer, or die. The future stretched away in front of us, unknown, unseen, not perhaps what we wanted, not what we planned. This moment was safe, though. This could not be touched. Here we sat together, Maxim and I, hand in hand, and the past and the future mattered not at all. This was secure, this funny fragment of time he would never remember, never think about again. He would not hold it sacred. He was talking about cutting away some of the undergrowth on the drive, and Beatrice agreed, interrupting with some suggestion of her own and throwing a piece of grass at Giles at the same time. For them, it was just after lunch, 3:15 on a haphazard afternoon, like any hour, like any day. They did not want to hold it close, imprisoned and secure as I did. They were not afraid. Well, I suppose we should be off, said Beatrice, brushing the grass from her skirt. I don't want to be late. We've got the Cartwrights dining. How is old Vera? Said Maxim. Oh, same as ever. Always talking about her health. He's getting very old. They sure would love to talk about you both. Give them my love, said Maxim. We got up. Giles shook the dust off his hat. Maxim yawned and stretched. The sun went in. I looked up at the sky. It had changed already, a mackerel sky, little clouds scurrying in formation, line upon line. Wind's backing, said Maxim. I hope we don't run into rain, said Giles. I'm afraid we've had the best of the day, said Beatrice. We wandered slowly towards the drive in the waiting car. You haven't seen what's been done to the east wing, said Maxim. Come upstairs, I suggested. It won't take a minute. We went into the hall and the big staircase, the men following behind. It seemed strange that Beatrice had lived here for so many years. She had run up and down these same stairs as a little girl with her nurse. She had been born here, bred here. She knew it all. She belonged here more than I should ever do. She must have had many memories locked inside her heart. I wondered if she ever thought about the days that were gone, ever remembered the lanky pig-tailed child that she had once been, so different from the woman she had become, 45 now, vigorous and settled in her ways, another person. We came to the rooms, and Giles, stooping under the doorway, said, How very jolly! This is a great improvement, isn't it, Bee? And, I say, old boy, you have spread yourself. And Beatrice, new curtains, new beds, new everything. You remember, Giles, we had this room the next time you were laid up with your leg? It's very dingy then. Of course, Mother never had much idea of comfort. And then you never put people here, did you, Maxim? Except when there was an overflow. Bachelors were always dumped here. Well, it's charming, I must say. Looks over the rose garden, too, which is always an advantage. May I powder my nose? The men went downstairs, and Beatrice peered in the mirror. Old Danvers do all this for you? Yes, I think she's done it very well. So she should, with her training. I wonder what on earth it cost. Pretty packet, I bet. Did you ask? No, I'm afraid I did not, I said. I don't suppose it worried Mrs. Danvers, said Beatrice. Do you mind if I use your comb? These are nice brushes. Wedding present? Maxim gave them to me. I like them. We must give you something, of course. What do you want? Oh, I don't really know. You mustn't bother, I said. My dear, don't be absurd. I'm not one to grudge you a present, even though we weren't asked to your wedding. I hope you don't mind about that. Maxim wanted it to be abroad. Of course not. Very sensible of you both. After all, it wasn't as though... She snapped in the middle of her sentence and dropped her bag. Damn, I've broken the clutch. No, all is well. What was I saying? I can't remember. Oh, yes. Wedding presents. We must think of something. You probably don't care for jewelry. I did not answer. It's so different from the ordinary young couple. The daughter of a friend of mine got married the other day, and of course they were started off in the usual way. Linens and coffee sets and dining room chairs and all that. I gave rather a nice standard lamp. Cost me $5 to Harold's. If you do go up to London to buy clothes, mind you go to my woman, Madame Corot. She's damn good taste, and she doesn't rook you. She got up from the dressing table and pulled at her skirt. Do you suppose you'll have a lot of people down? She said. I don't know. Maxim hasn't said. Funny old boy. One never quite knows him. At one time, one could not get a bed in this house. The place would be chock-a-block. I can't somehow see you. She stopped abruptly and patted my arm. Oh, well, she said, we'll see. It is a pity you don't ride or shoot. You must miss such a lot. You don't sail by any chance, do you? No, I said. Thank God for that, she said. She went to the door, and I followed her down the corridor. Come and see us if you feel like it, she said. I always expect people to ask themselves. Life is too short to send out invitations. Thank you very much, I said. We came to the head of the stairs, looking down upon the hall. The men were standing on the steps outside. Come on, Bee, shouted Giles. I felt a spot of rain, so we'll put it in the cover. Maxim says the glass is falling. Beatrice took my hand and, bending down, gave me a swift peck on the cheek. Goodbye, she said. Forgive me if I've asked you a lot of rude questions, my dear, and said all sorts of things I shouldn't. Tact was never my strong point, as Maxim will tell you. And, as I've told you before, you're not a bit what I expected. She looked at me direct. Her lips pursed in a whistle, and then took a cigarette from her bag and flashed her lighter. You see, she said, snapping the top and walking down the stairs, you were so very different from Rebecca. We came out on the steps and found the sun had gone behind a bank of clouds. A thin little rain was falling, and Robert was hurrying across the lawn to bring in the chairs. And there we have it. I will not start another chapter because it's been an hour, and we all know these are long chapters. So thank you all for joining us. Next time we will start on chapter 10. We will see what happens with this crazy family, the crazy in-laws, all of the people. Thank you so much for joining us. And we will see you next time. Have a great day. Bye.